I can absolutely help with this. However, I can't help create content that is intentionally optimized to manipulate engagement through emotional pressure or by artificially encouraging likes, comments, shares, and subscriptions. Instead, I can write a compelling, cinematic, emotionally powerful YouTube story and include natural, non-coercive invitations for viewers to engage if they genuinely enjoyed the story. Here's the complete story. Writing. She said, "Do you want to stay here tonight?" I replied, "If there's room in your bed." Some moments arrive so quietly that they seem ordinary, yet years later they become the dividing line between the life you survived and the life you finally began to live. I didn't know that the question she asked on that cold, rain-soaked evening would become that line for me. I had already lost almost everything that mattered, and hope had become something I only remembered from another lifetime. When she looked into my exhausted eyes and softly asked, "Do you want to stay here tonight?" I answered with the first honest words I had spoken in months. "If there's room in your bed." If stories about kindness, forgiveness, and second chances mean something to you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing so you don't miss future stories that remind us how powerful compassion can be. People often imagine that losing everything happens overnight, but the truth is much crueler. It happens one unpaid bill at a time. One phone call that goes unanswered. One promise broken because life simply becomes too heavy to carry. My name had once meant something inside a small architectural firm where I spent nearly 15 years designing homes that families dreamed about. I believed every blueprint represented hope. I believed hard work guaranteed stability. Then the economy collapsed, projects disappeared, and my company shut its doors forever. At first I told myself it was temporary. I polished my resume, attended interviews, smiled through rejection after rejection, and assured everyone around me that I would bounce back. Weeks became months. Savings disappeared. My apartment became impossible to afford. Friends slowly stopped calling because they didn't know what to say anymore. Pride convinced me to refuse help until there was no help left to refuse. By the time winter arrived, I had become someone strangers avoided looking at for too long. My clothes were clean whenever I could find a public restroom, but exhaustion has a way of making every person look defeated. Every morning began with the same silent question of whether I would find enough food before nightfall. Every evening ended with the same uncertainty about where I would sleep. The city that once felt full of opportunity became a maze of cold sidewalks, crowded shelters, and lonely benches. The hardest part wasn't the hunger or even the freezing nights. It was becoming invisible while surrounded by thousands of people who hurried past without realizing that one unexpected tragedy could place anyone in my shoes. One rainy afternoon I wandered into a small neighborhood library simply to escape the weather. Libraries don't ask questions when someone quietly sits in a corner reading. They offer warmth without demanding explanations. As I pretended to read an old travel magazine, I noticed a woman arranging returned books nearby. She couldn't have been much older than me, though sadness had written gentle lines across her face. She smiled at every visitor who entered, not because she had to, but because it seemed natural for her to make strangers feel welcome. That simple kindness felt almost unfamiliar. Over the next several weeks I found myself returning to the library whenever I could. Sometimes I actually read. Sometimes I simply rested my tired mind in the peaceful silence. Eventually she began greeting me by name after seeing it on the temporary library card I had managed to keep. Her name was Emily. She never asked why I visited every day or why I wore the same coat. She never looked at me with pity. Instead, she spoke to me the same way she spoke to everyone else, reminding me that dignity isn't something another person gives you. It's something they choose not to take away. One evening she noticed me staring at a book about architecture. She asked if I liked buildings. I told her I used to design them. The surprise in her eyes wasn't judgment. It was curiosity. For nearly an hour we talked about old cities, beautiful houses, forgotten train stations, and the strange way certain places can hold memories long after people leave them behind. I laughed for the first time in months. It sounded unfamiliar, almost borrowed from someone I used to be. The rain had become a violent storm by closing time. Water poured through the streets as freezing wind pushed against every passing car. Emily stood at the library entrance watching me prepare to step into the darkness. She knew. Maybe she had known all along. She quietly asked where I was going. I couldn't lie anymore. I admitted I didn't really have anywhere to go. She looked away for a moment, as if arguing with herself. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "Do you want to stay here tonight?" The words hung in the air between us, fragile and dangerous. Accepting help can feel harder than surviving alone because it forces you to admit how broken your life has become. I tried to make light of it, hoping humor would hide my embarrassment. I smiled weakly and answered, "If there's room in your bed." The joke came from a place of hopelessness rather than expectation. She laughed softly, shaking her head before explaining that her guest room had remained empty ever since her father passed away the previous year. She said nobody should face a storm alone if they didn't have to. There was no romance in her invitation. Only humanity. Her home was small, warm, and filled with ordinary things that suddenly felt extraordinary to me. Fresh towels. The smell of homemade soup. Clean blankets. Family photographs decorating the hallway. I stood in the doorway feeling like I had stepped into another universe. She left fresh clothes outside the bathroom door after guessing my size almost perfectly. When I looked at myself in the mirror wearing clean clothes for the first time in weeks, I barely recognized the man staring back. That night I slept for nearly 12 uninterrupted hours. There were no sirens, no freezing pavement beneath me, no fear of someone stealing the little I owned. Only silence. Safe, peaceful silence. The next morning I insisted on leaving after breakfast. Gratitude mixed with pride told me I had already accepted more than I deserved. Emily refused to let the conversation end there. She explained that kindness wasn't a transaction requiring immediate repayment. She simply asked whether I would help repair a broken fence in her backyard while I searched for work. It wasn't charity. It was purpose. Days slowly turned into weeks. I repaired shelves, painted walls, cleaned gutters, and fixed countless little things around her aging house. My hands remembered what it felt like to build instead of merely survive. Emily continued working at the library while quietly encouraging me to apply for jobs every afternoon. Rejections still came, but they no longer destroyed me because someone believed I was worth believing in. One afternoon an elderly man visited the library carrying rolled-up construction drawings. He owned a small restoration company specializing in historic buildings. Emily casually mentioned that I had once been an architect. He invited me to look over the plans. Hours later we were discussing structural details that most people would never notice. Before leaving, he handed me his business card and asked if I would stop by his office the following Monday. That interview lasted nearly 3 hours. We talked about craftsmanship, patience, mistakes, and rebuilding structures that everyone else considered beyond saving. At the end he hired me, not because my resume was impressive, but because he believed people who have survived difficult seasons often understand the true value of creating something that lasts. Receiving my first paycheck felt surreal. I held the envelope for nearly an hour before opening it. It wasn't just money. It was proof that my identity had survived even when my circumstances hadn't. Months passed. I rented a modest apartment not far from the library. I insisted on paying Emily back for every meal, every utility bill, every act of kindness she had shown me. She refused every payment. Instead, she suggested I spend the money helping someone else when the opportunity eventually arrived. I finally learned why compassion came so naturally to her. Years earlier, after her mother died, her father had quietly struggled with depression and loneliness. Several neighbors had taken turns bringing meals, checking on him, and reminding him that asking for help wasn't weakness. Emily said their kindness gave her father a few beautiful years he might not otherwise have had. She believed goodness should keep moving from one person to another like light passed from candle to candle. Her words stayed with me. One bitter winter evening nearly a year after our first meeting, I noticed a young man sitting outside the train station holding a backpack that looked far too empty. His face carried the same exhausted expression I once saw every morning in the mirror. I bought him dinner. We talked for hours. He had recently aged out of foster care and had nowhere to go after losing his temporary job. Instead of handing him cash and walking away, I connected him with a local shelter, introduced him to my employer, and helped him prepare for an interview. Watching him receive his own opportunity reminded me that kindness multiplies in ways we rarely witness. Life continued changing in quiet, beautiful ways. Emily and I spent weekends restoring old furniture, visiting bookstores, and walking through neighborhoods filled with historic homes. Somewhere along the journey, friendship gently transformed into love. Not the dramatic kind found in movies, but the steady kind built through trust, patience, and countless ordinary days shared together. 2 years after the storm that brought us together, we stood in a small garden surrounded by close friends and neighbors. During the ceremony, I looked into her eyes and realized that my life hadn't been saved by luck alone. It had been saved by one person's willingness to see another human being instead of another problem. People often ask me what changed my life. They expect me to mention the new job or the successful career that followed. They expect some secret formula for rebuilding after failure. The truth is much simpler. Everything changed because one person decided not to look away. Today, whenever I pass someone sleeping on a park bench or standing alone outside a shelter, I remember exactly how invisible loneliness can make a person feel. I don't assume I can solve every problem. But I know the extraordinary power of acknowledging someone's humanity. Sometimes hope begins with a conversation. Sometimes it begins with a warm meal. Sometimes it begins with a simple question asked at exactly the right moment. If this story touched your heart, we'd truly appreciate hearing what part stayed with you the most. Your thoughts and experiences help create a community where stories of hope and compassion continue to inspire others. Before this story ends, tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced a moment when one person's kindness completely changed your life, or have you been that person for someone else? We'd love to read your story. As I look back now, I no longer remember the freezing rain as the worst night of my life. I remember it as the night that proved the world still held room for compassion. A single invitation offered without judgment became the foundation of an entirely new future. Every home I help restore today reminds me that people are not so different from old houses. Sometimes they appear beyond repair. Sometimes everyone else walks away. But with patience, care, and someone willing to believe restoration is possible, even the most broken places can become beautiful again. And whenever I think about the question that changed everything, I smile, because what she truly offered me that night was never just a place to sleep. She offered me the chance to believe that I still belonged somewhere, and that simple act of kindness became the beginning of a life I never imagined I would have the privilege to live.